Chapter 32. So what's this about a background check before you sell ammunition? Kirana asked an intimidated sales clerk. The associate was a chubby male in his late teens. As nervous as Jonathan had been around Kirana, her beauty rendered this poor sales clerk absolutely speechless. "Well," started the clerk as sweat beaded on his brow, The owner was pressured by the governor, and so I'm only allowed to defend myself if the governor thinks I deserve to?" asked Kirana angrily. It's a stupid idea," said the clerk. "I'm sure I can make an exception." "Finally," said Kirana in a relieved tone, "someone with some common sense." They had been to several stores and through the process of trial and error learned that since the council had drifted apart, governments were taking efforts to reduce the crimes perpetrated by demon worshippers by restricting access to ammunition. They had also learned that people seemed to be intimidated by people wearing long coats and carrying swords and guns. Jonathan had helped people calm down using the power of his key, but to be safe, they had gone to other stores. They had also found a used truck that they had acquired for a large portion of Jonathan's credits. They had stored their cloaks and weapons in the truck before attempting again to acquire ammunition. Kirana had thought that her well-articulated argument had persuaded the young sales clerk to become helpful, but Jonathan could tell that her slender figure and form-fitting attire had been far more persuasive. He frowned, but avoided saying anything that might prevent them from acquiring supplies. The clerk rang up the boxes of ammunition in his register, and Jonathan paid with his credit drive. "Thank you," said Kirana with a smile. "You've been so helpful." The clerk turned bright red as he fumbled with his register. You're welcome," he finally managed to stammer. Jonathan and Kirana walked quietly out of the store and loaded their newly acquired ammunition into their truck, which was parked at the far end of the parking lot. "Was that okay to play with his feelings like that?" asked Jonathan at last. Kirana rolled her eyes. "Do you not see all the ammunition we got?" she asked. "Of course it was okay. It was necessary. Besides, is it okay to require a background check on someone that won't be born for hundreds of years?" "I'm just saying that made me feel uncomfortable," said Jonathan in a low voice as he looked away. "Would it have made you feel more comfortable if we had stolen them?" asked Kirana in an annoyed tone. "Well, probably not," said Jonathan. "Then what's the problem?" snapped Kirana as she got into the passenger seat of the truck and slammed the door. Jonathan slowly got into the driver's seat. Kirana avoided looking at him because she was upset with him. She thought he knew what was at stake. She thought he would have been impressed with how well she manipulated the sales clerk. Kirana felt unappreciated. She hated that he was questioning this because she was certain it had been the best moral decision. Started Jonathan. You what?" snapped Kirana as she whirled to face him. "I didn't like how he looked at you," said Jonathan at last. Kirana's expression softened. Kirana had felt jealousy herself. She remembered back to how she had felt when Stephanie had been trying to win his affections, and in that instant, all of her frustration and anger melted away. "You were jealous," said Kirana softly. Jonathan opened his mouth to object, but realized that was the perfect word for describing his emotional state, and slowly closed it without making a sound. Finally he nodded. "Don't be," whispered Kirana. Jonathan looked into her blue eyes expecting reprimand, but found compassion and empathy instead. He felt calm and relaxation wrap around him, as though these feelings were a warm blanket in the cold zone. Suddenly Kirana grabbed his head behind his ears and pressed her lips against his. The moment of surprise lasted only a moment, as he quickly became determined to make this kiss his only concern. He closed his eyes and ran his fingers through Kirana's long dark hair. After a moment they stopped and looked into one another's eyes. "You wouldn't be playing with my feelings, would you?" asked Jonathan. idiot," whispered Kirana as she kissed him again. Lucas had traveled for quite some time on foot. He had enjoyed not being seated for hours and getting some fresh air and sunlight. Eventually, he had accepted a ride from a kind-hearted farmer on his way to the city. The man had refused any sort of payment, even with Lucas's offers to compensate him. Reluctantly, Lucas had left his benefactor and made his way toward the library as though he had been in the town before. Of course, he had not been there before, but the power of his divine key allowed him to see the construction of the town, from a handful of buildings to the cluster of city blocks that house dozens of businesses, offices, parks, schools, and a moderately sized library. As he opened the door and walked in, the elderly woman at the desk greeted him with a wrinkled smile, which he returned. Carts of books blocked the aisles between bookshelves. There were other students present in the library that carried packs, though Lucas could tell that none of them contained short shotguns, knives, ammunition, or non-perishable food items. Likely these students were carrying books, pens, and other school supplies. No one seemed to notice Lucas as he began perusing through history books. Instead of the selective view that he obtained from the Key of Origins, this was a general overview and provided him with a new perspective. Each of the books at which he looked at was biased with respect to what the authors believed to be important. He was fascinated by ancient world wars that pitted governmental superpowers against one another. Even more fascinating was the advent of Civil War II, where the United States of America divided apart. Of course, there were numerous causes for conflict. Representatives in Congress from half the country were elected to stop the policies proposed by representatives of the other half, and the reverse was also true. It seemed ironic that as the government accumulated more power, it became less capable of action. Adding to the frustration, when laws were created or amended, the courts could overturn the changes without repercussion. It soon became clear that real power could be harnessed from courts, and a period of manipulation and corruption known as the reign of the judges prevailed for several decades. Judges and court officers were bribed by corporations and unions to render verdicts and findings that were favorable only to them. Lucas read through books describing the time when the Federalist States of America were formed. Frustration with corporate and government corruption boiled over until cries for secession became more serious. Texas became the first state to secede, and most of the southern states followed quickly. After a long and terrible war, the Federalist States of America prevailed, and the remaining United States were absorbed into the new nation. As interesting as the history of this age was to Lucas as he perused books, eventually he came across a dusty tome with the title, The Council of Nine. He blew a small cloud of dust into the air after removing it from its shelf. As he opened the cover, a sheet of paper fell down at his feet. He bent down and picked it up. It was a letter. His eyes widened as he read the contents. Dear Erica, I hope by the time you read this you will have found closure in the matter with your husband. Peter would not have wanted you to suffer. He had a vision of a golden age and a plan to put it into motion. Although I was the only one with power to see the future, I suspect that you always knew that lasting peace and prosperity is not a cheap experience, and that mankind must pay a price in order to have it. I do not think that our council is prepared for this. Drew is pure of heart, but he is no leader. I write to you in the hopes that you will take Peter's place and lead us toward the ideal he envisioned when he recruited us those many years ago. I know that you have always viewed my visions with skepticism, and I do not blame you. I am not always in possession of my faculties. I ask you to set aside your skepticism for a moment and to consider what I feel compelled to write to you. If things do not change, there is a terrible calamity that will consume humanity. There is a creature that will come to destroy the earth. His power will leave a frozen waste and a heap of ash over the ends of the earth, and even the moon will become as a cloven hoof when he strikes. Although you have not believed me before, I urge you to remember my words when you see the man of your visions appear before you. He is coming. The purpose of the divine keys is not to be realized in our time, but in the future. After the third betrayer is defeated, he will... Lucas flipped the page over, but there was nothing more written. He flipped through the pages of the book, but there were no additional pages. He turned to his key, hoping that he could see who wrote this letter, and what else they might have said. His eyes began glowing as he focused on the page. Suddenly he found himself standing in the same building, but noticing the shelves and tables were in a different arrangement. An elderly man was seated at the table writing a letter. Suddenly he looked up as if he could see Lucas and stuffed the letter into the cover of the book. Lucas caught a glimpse of the title, The Council of Nine. "What are you doing?" shouted the man. "Don't you realize it's rude to read other people's correspondence?" Since he was having a vision, Lucas turned around to see who the man might be addressing, but saw no one else. "Yes, I am speaking to you, young man," said the elderly man. Lucas turned back. "There's no one there," said a familiar female voice from the other side of the room. Lucas looked and saw Jennifer Cedar lying down on a couch on the other side of the room. She sighed and closed her eyes, almost immediately falling asleep. The old man sighed as he looked at Jennifer and then turned back to Lucas. "Well, I can see you," he said softly. He turned back to Jennifer, who did not seem to be disturbed by the volume he chose. "Who are you?" whispered Lucas, who was still unsure that he could be seen or heard in his vision. "I'm Aaron Pratt," he said. Lucas's eyes widened. "Who are you?" "Lucas Flynn," said Lucas softly. Aaron tilted his head and furrowed his brow. "Lucas Flynn," he said. "That name seems familiar, yet somehow out of place." "I'm in the future," said Lucas. "That's fortunate," said Aaron. "I can see the future, you know. I am the bearer of the divine key of prophecy, after all." "Yes, I know," said Lucas. "No need to be snide, young man," said Aaron with a frown. "I'm not being snide," said Lucas. "What's your name, young man?" asked Aaron. Lucas scowled. "Lucas Flynn," said Lucas again. "Lucas Flynn," he said again. "I've heard that before." "Didn't we just talk about this?" asked Lucas. "I don't remember," said Aaron. "What's your name?" "My name is Lucas Flynn," said Lucas in an exasperated tone. "Please don't ask me again. I don't like repeating myself." "Why not?" asked Aaron in a matter-of-fact tone. "Everything repeats. Everything is a cycle. Children are born, they grow up, they have more children, and they die." There was something about the word cycle that made Lucas pause. Because Lucas had the key of origins, he felt some responsibility to ensure that his friends did not repeat the mistakes of the past. "Are the divine keys a cycle?" asked Lucas. "What is the purpose of the divine keys?" "Why would you be so curious about the divine keys?" asked Aaron suspiciously. Lucas pulled the chain about his neck and revealed his own mirrored key. "I have the key of origins," said Lucas. "Finding out about their purpose is my goal here." "Say, you're not Joshua Beckman," said Aaron. "You're from the future. You must be Lucas Flynn." Lucas rubbed his forehead in frustration. "You started to write a letter to Erica Kingsley about the purpose of the divine keys," said Lucas. "How would you know that?" said Aaron angrily. "It's rude to spy on other people." "Listen," said Lucas, "I just want to know about the keys, or maybe you could tell me something about the Archangel." "Now how would you know about the Archangel?" asked Aaron. "I haven't told anyone who he really is." "Why did he create the divine keys?" asked Lucas. Oh, if you were to ask Peter when he was alive, he would have said it was to benefit mankind and establish peace and prosperity for all, said Aaron. And I think that's sort of why he made them, but I think it was for something much more specific. Much will be required from those that carry the burden of destiny. For example... There was a pause as Lucas waited for Aaron to elaborate. "I have to pee," shouted Aaron. Jennifer slowly sat up. "What?" she said. "I need to pee," he repeated. He got up and went to the bathroom. Slowly Lucas's vision faded. He looked down and found himself holding the same book. He shrugged and decided to read it anyway. To his surprise, the passage he read referred to David Young, the unstable son of Dr. Timothy Young. The paragraph described his aspirations to uncover the source of power behind the divine keys. He apparently had spent years searching for a cave where a demon had acquired power without any keys, but he had never been able to locate it. The passage brought the first vision that Lucas had seen of Jacob Wilson back to his memory, when the senator had found a cavern that seemed to match his description. The more Lucas thought about everything that he had been shown in visions, the more unusual it seemed to him. Why was it important to know how Daniel Young gained knowledge of Abaddon if they were simply meant to defeat him? Why was it important to know the role of Senator Jacob Wilson in tracking down the sleeping sickness? Why was the Key of Origins not giving him something specific to their efforts to change the past? Lucas dismissed the feelings of doubt that had crept into his mind and tried to take comfort in the soundness of their strategy. He was convinced they were doing the right thing. Of course, had he known the consequences of following the path down which they were walking, he would have invested a lot more thought into why Jacob Wilson had been in his visions.